I'm going to show you the different types of narcissistic syndromes that can look very different on the outside, but have the same narcissistic core. It's fascinating all the different ways that narcissism can show up, and a lot of times even the experts miss these important differences. It's Gabrielle, and for over 12 years I've been a licensed professional counselor and relationship expert in private practice in Boulder, Colorado. And my practice is grounded in the science of what makes relationships work. Today, you'll get an overview of the different narcissistic syndromes so you know what to look out for if you're struggling in your relationship. Now, if you like the relationship advice and couples tips that you're learning in these videos, please subscribe to my YouTube channel right now. Just click on the subscribe button right here. And if you're enjoying these videos, please give this a like and share it. And please go to my websites, thepowercoupleformula.com, for lots more information about how to build an amazing relationship, and powercoupleseducation.com to stay connected. Okay, let's get into it. The first clinical syndrome that we're going to talk about is the shy narcissist. This is a person who is timid, anxious, comes across as quite insecure. And if you get to know them a little deeper, you'll find that they're quite sexually inhibited. So this isn't the typical narcissistic picture that most people think of when they think of narcissism, which is much more extroverted. This person is very introverted. They're the go-along to get along person. They learn to be overly compliant because as a child, they had to avoid a parent's hostility and attack toward them by taking care of that parent's self-esteem, making sure that they didn't do anything to rock the boat or upset the parent. They had to mirror back to their parent how great the parent was, rather than their parent mirroring to them how wonderful they were. Consequently, that child was never allowed to experience their own preciousness, their own value on their own terms. Shy narcissists look very neurotic on the outside, but if you look at their fantasy life, if you get to know them and you start to ask them about their dreams, their fantasies, even their nightmares, you'll find that they actually have a very grandiose sense of self, a sense of being superior to other people, and that a lot of their fantasies involve devaluing other people. So they struggle with a profound sense of envy of other people. It's kind of this feeling that other people are the ones who, are in the limelight, and they're sort of in the shadows picking up the crumbs. And they feel a lot of resentment and a lot of envy about that. Next is a more familiar narcissistic syndrome. With men, it's called the Don Juan syndrome. With women, we often refer to it as the cold exhibitionistic type of character. So these are the exhibitionists. With this group, you see a lot of sexual promiscuity, but at the same time, it's combined with a real incapacity to love. Now, if you think about the Don Juan character for a moment, these are people who are very sexually seductive. They idealize women. They get into these very short, passionate relationships that last only for a few months at a time, and then they're on to the next lover. And so this person is very self-centered and really exaggerates their attractiveness to women. And they're usually very successful with women. They're very good at convincing women that they're the man of their life. But unfortunately, this is a very transitory kind of idealization that happens where this man will find a woman who he thinks is just, the most wonderful creature in the world, and then it pretty soon fizzles out and he's done with her. Women have their own version of this Don Juan syndrome, and as I said, we call that cold exhibitionism. So by cold exhibitionism, we mean that these are people who might dress very provocatively and really lead with their sexuality, but in a very kind of cold, removed sort of way. These are not warm, gushing people who are kind of all over you. They're actually much more reserved and exude this kind of cold sexuality. The similarity between the Don Juan and the cold exhibitionist is that neither one of them has a capacity for true commitment to a long-term, committed, intimate relationship. They want you to think that they're beautiful, attractive, God's gift to humanity, but they're not actually really interested in your real feelings or needs, or in really going any deeper than a very surface sexual contact. So in early adulthood, in their 20s and 30s, Don Juans and cold exhibitionists tend to have a lot of success in attracting partners and going through multiple relationships and never ever really going deep with any one person. And part of this is that they are physically attractive because they're younger and they haven't gained weight or gotten wrinkles yet. And so they're kind of relying on their physical attractiveness to see them through. What happens as these people get older is really aging is kind of the ultimate narcissistic injury, because they are no longer able to attract mates the way they were when they were younger. Because their physical attractiveness is all they had to rely on, they can start to really fall into a depression. And I guess you could call that depressive realism, because they're starting to realize that that was actually quite an empty existence. And so very often these people will start to look for treatment in their mid-40s, in their 50s and 60s, because of this kind of general disillusionment that they go through, this loss of interest in the sorts of conquests that used to really turn them on. And they end up feeling a lot of loneliness and isolation. And a lot of times that can be a real impetus for them to get into therapy. These patients can actually experience some real success in their 50s and 60s in therapy and begin to work through some of this narcissistic syndrome, something that wasn't possible for them when they were younger because of how gratifying it was to fulfill these narcissistic needs in their sexual life. The next syndrome we're going to talk about here is the thick and thin-skinned syndrome. One way of thinking about narcissism is that people can be either very thick-skinned or very thin-skinned. And with thick skin, what we really mean is that the person is kind of like overly self-assured, overly self-assertive. And at the same time, they have no ability to introspect at all. And so they're very averse to any kind of looking at themselves, looking within, or considering how they might be contributing to a problem in the relationship. They're very defended against that kind of introspection, and that makes them extremely difficult to relate to and extremely difficult to treat in psychotherapy. So they have incredibly powerful psychological defenses against getting intimately involved on an emotional level with another person. On the outside, they may be very high functioning, very successful at work and get a lot done throughout the day, and they're not depressed. They're not vulnerable people, at least on the surface. But the downside of that is that they're really quite impenetrable on an emotional level. Now, with the thin-skinned variety of narcissism, this person has a much weaker sense of self. But it's actually easier to treat them because they are less defended. And so they're more open to looking at how they might be contributing to problems in their relationships with the people around them. They can be hypersensitive to being mistreated or to failure, and they can react very immediately by getting depressed. That can alternate with being rageful because they never feel truly appreciated for the magnificence of their full self. So these are people who tend to have a lot of difficulty functioning in work, in intimate relationships, and socially. And that's one of the ways that you can kind of distinguish them from the thick-skinned, who very often seem on the outside, as I said, to be very high functioning. Another syndrome we see with narcissism is what we call the syndrome of arrogance. They tend to devalue the people around them, including if you happen to be their therapist. And if something doesn't go their way, they tend to handle it in a very arrogant way. So they might, accuse the other person of being stupid and blame them and as though it's completely their fault. It's important to understand that this arrogance is a way of defending against becoming dependent on another person, whether that is dependent on a therapist for their help and insight, or dependent on an intimate partner for getting their emotional needs met. The arrogance protects them from any sense of dependency, which would make them very vulnerable. That's because when they were little and they were naturally dependent on a parent, that didn't go well for them. They were met with hostility and derision and envy and attack, neglect and abuse by a parent. And so they learned very early to use that arrogance as a form of protection against vulnerability. The next syndrome is what we call narcissistic-masochistic structures. These are the people who are the greatest sufferers that the world has ever seen, or at least they think they are. They make sure you know at every turn how great the weight is that they carry on their back. They let you know in no uncertain terms that this is the most important aspect of their life. This really becomes the source of their arrogance. These people can alternate between being very aggressive toward other people and imagining that other people are being very aggressive toward them. So they will project their aggression onto their mate or their therapist and imagine that they're being they're being attacked or treated in a hostile way when they're not. So they can come across as quite paranoid at times. But at other times, they can get very depressed and start to devalue themselves. So there's this ongoing kind of struggle between asserting how great they are and being very arrogant and very hostile, and imagining that they're being victimized by other people, being aggressed upon. And they seem to vacillate back and forth between those two identities. These descriptions of narcissistic syndromes that I shared with you today are drawn from the pioneering work of Otto Kernberg, who is one of the foremost researchers and psychoanalysts of the 20th century, who was a clinician now in his 90s and has been in the field for over 70 years. And I want to thank him for his amazing work in this area. I'll put a link to his work in the notes below. And now I'd like to hear from you. Do any of these types of narcissism ring a bell in terms of specific people whom you've known in your life? These people can be extremely challenging, but my hope is that understanding something about them and what they've been through will help you see them in a different light. Leave me your comments below, and I look forward to reading them and seeing you in the next video.